Judge spots childhood friend on trial. The unexpected outcome will blow your mind. In every courtroom, justice stands at the center of every decision, weighing the facts and the law with an impartial eye. But what happens when the person sitting in the defendant's chair is someone from your past? Someone you once shared laughter and dreams with? What if that person, now standing accused of a crime, is someone you once called a friend? This is a story about choices, justice, and the weight of the past. It's about how life can change in the blink of an eye, and how even the most rigid systems of law are often challenged by the human heart. The courtroom was filled with the usual murmurs, the soft rustle of papers, the steady rhythm of heels clicking on the marble floor, and the ever-present anticipation that accompanies a trial. The air was thick with the tension of a day like any other. Except for one detail. Today, a familiar name would be called. Judge Amanda Clark sat at the bench, her eyes scanning over the case before her. It was another typical day in the courtroom, another case in a long line of routine legal proceedings. As she glanced down at the folder in front of her, her eyes caught the name of the defendant, the state of Ohio versus Jason Miller. Her heart skipped a beat. Jason Miller, the name alone sent a rush of memories flooding back, memories of summers spent riding bikes along the suburban streets of Cleveland, of late-night talks under the stars, and of promises made between two young friends who swore they'd always have each other's backs. But the man who now stood before her, shackled at the wrists and ankles, was not the Jason she remembered. His face was lined with years of hardship, his shoulders hunched, and his eyes, though still recognizable, were hardened by the weight of life. He had changed, but she could still see the boy she once knew beneath the surface. The courtroom fell silent as Jason's eyes met hers. His expression shifted from shock to resignation, a brief flicker of recognition before he quickly looked away, bowing his head slightly. Amanda's breath caught in her throat. She wanted to shout his name, to run to him, to ask him what had happened. But this was no longer the time for such things. Mr. Miller. Amanda's voice wavered slightly, but she quickly regained composure. You stand accused of armed robbery and assault. How do you plead? Jason's voice was rough, almost unrecognizable. Not guilty, Your Honor. Amanda felt the weight of those words settle heavily in the pit of her stomach. There were so many questions she wanted to ask, but her role as a judge demanded neutrality. She couldn't let her personal history cloud her judgment. She couldn't let her memories of their childhood alter the path that lay before them both. She cleared her throat and gestured for the prosecution to proceed, forcing herself to focus on the case at hand. But as the prosecutor began to speak, Amanda's mind wandered, drifting back to the days when she and Jason were inseparable. How could things have gone so wrong? How had their paths diverged so drastically? Amanda's thoughts were interrupted as the prosecutor began describing the alleged crime. Jason was accused of entering a local convenience store, assaulting a clerk, and stealing a cash register. The clerk had suffered minor injuries, and Jason had been arrested nearby, the stolen money still in his possession. It seemed straightforward, but Amanda couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this story. Jason had always been the kind of person who would stand up for others, not someone who would resort to violence. She tried to push the thoughts aside. She had a job to do. She had to remain impartial. But with every passing moment, the courtroom felt smaller, and the memories of her childhood friendship with Jason grew louder. Amanda glanced at Jason once more, her eyes locking with his for a brief moment. A part of her wanted to reach out, to offer comfort, to remind him of the promise they once made to always have each other's backs. But she couldn't. Not now, not here. The trial had begun. and the journey toward the truth was just beginning. As the trial continued, Amanda's mind never fully left the courtroom. Each witness called to the stand seemed to blur together, their testimonies sinking into the background of her consciousness. But her thoughts kept drifting back to Jason, to the memories they had shared, to the boy she had known before this man, this stranger, stood before her. The prosecutor had laid out the case clearly. Jason was accused of assaulting a store clerk during a robbery at a convenience store in downtown Cleveland. The clerk had testified that a man, dressed in dark clothing, had entered the store, argued with him, and then physically attacked him. The store's security cameras had captured the moment, though the footage was grainy, making it difficult to identify the suspect with any certainty. Amanda couldn't shake the unease that settled in her chest. This wasn't the Jason she knew. The man she had grown up with had a sense of honor, a quiet strength that had always set him apart. He'd been a dreamer, someone who had talked about leaving Cleveland, escaping the small-town life where people's expectations and prejudice often held him back. Jason had always believed there was more out there for him, more than the limitations the world had placed on him simply because of where he came from. But here he was, accused of a crime that seemed to defy everything Amanda remembered about him. She had to focus. She couldn't afford to let their shared history cloud her judgment. She reminded herself that this wasn't about who she had known years ago. This was about the man before her, and whether or not the evidence could prove his guilt. But the more she observed, the more she wondered, was the evidence enough to condemn him? The first few witnesses for the prosecution had painted a clear picture of what happened that night at the store. The clerk had described the suspect as a man in his 30s, with a rough demeanor, wearing a red hoodie and dark jeans. He had attacked the clerk without warning, taking the money and fleeing the scene quickly. Jason had been arrested just a few blocks away, with the stolen cash still on him. It seemed straightforward, but Amanda wasn't convinced. The defense, led by a young but capable lawyer named Sarah Hayes, had begun her cross-examination. Amanda watched intently as Sarah questioned the witnesses. The first point Sarah raised was the lack of certainty in the store clerk's identification. The clerk had said that the attacker's face was obscured by the hoodie, and that the lighting in the store was poor. Sarah had asked the clerk, "Are you certain the man you saw was the defendant, Mr. Miller?" The clerk hesitated before responding. "No, I couldn't see his face clearly." That uncertainty had created a flicker of doubt in Amanda's mind. If the clerk wasn't sure, then what did they really have to go on? The surveillance footage showed a figure in a red hoodie, but the quality was so poor that it was impossible to make any definitive identification. Amanda's thoughts shifted again as she recalled the summer before high school, when everything had changed between her and Jason. They had been inseparable, despite the way their families lived on opposite sides of the city, separated not just by distance but by the unspoken rules of their segregated world. Her family had lived in a modest home in a middle-class neighborhood, while Jason's lived at the edge of the city, in a small, run-down house on the outskirts of town. They'd been from different worlds, but their friendship had bridged that divide. She could still remember the day when it had all come crashing down, the day her father had caught them sitting together on the porch, laughing and talking. His face had gone cold with anger, and he had ordered her inside without explanation. Jason had stood there, frozen, his face a mask of hurt. "Go on," he had said quietly, not wanting to cause any trouble. "I'll see you around." That was the last time they'd spoken, and soon after, Jason's family had moved away. Amanda had thrown herself into her studies, determined to escape the small-mindedness of Cleveland, to go to law school and make a difference. But even as she moved forward in life, she couldn't shake the memory of the boy who had once taught her what true courage looked like. Now, sitting in the courtroom, Amanda couldn't help but wonder, what had happened to Jason after that summer? What had caused him to fall so far from the bright, hopeful boy she had known? As the lunch break approached, Amanda found herself lost in thought. She stepped away from the bench, walking toward the back chambers of the courtroom. Her assistant, Kevin, approached with a concerned look on his face. "Judge Clark," he said, his voice quiet. "You've been quiet today. Is everything all right?" Amanda paused, taking a deep breath before responding. "I'm fine, Kevin. Just a lot on my mind." But she wasn't fine. How could she be? The man on trial in front of her was someone she had once cared deeply about. And now she was responsible for deciding his fate. How could she possibly separate the past from the present? How could she remain impartial when every part of her wanted to understand what had gone wrong? She pushed the thought aside. She had a duty to uphold the law. She had a responsibility to see this case through with fairness and justice. But in her heart, Amanda knew that the answers to her questions wouldn't be found in the courtroom. The truth, it seemed, was far more complicated than any of the evidence suggested. As the trial resumed, Amanda steeled herself for the difficult road ahead. The case was far from over, and there was much more to uncover. But one thing was already clear to her: this trial was no longer just about the law. It was about the tangled, painful web of the shared history, and the battle between justice and compassion that would define the outcome of Jason's fate. The afternoon session of the trial was heavier than the mornings. The evidence, though circumstantial, seemed to build against Jason. As Amanda sat at the bench, her mind buzzed with conflicting thoughts. The prosecutor's case was neatly constructed, but there was an underlying tension that Amanda couldn't ignore. The more she saw, the more uncertain she became. The defense had already begun its cross-examination, and Sarah Hayes, Jason's attorney, had proven herself to be sharp. She'd questioned the store clerk again, poking holes in his identification. The clerk had admitted that he hadn't been able to get a clear look at the man's face, only describing the figure by his clothing and the way he moved. But without an undeniable connection, it was hard for Amanda to feel confident that Jason was the right person standing accused. Then came the surveillance footage. It was grainy and unclear. The man on screen seemed to match Jason's build, but the poor quality of the video made it impossible to confirm. The prosecution had relied heavily on this as evidence, but Amanda felt a gnawing doubt at the back of her mind. Jason hadn't been caught red-handed, and there was no clear physical evidence linking him to the crime. Yet the narrative that the prosecution was weaving was persuasive, perhaps too persuasive. As the jury observed the proceedings, Amanda couldn't help but notice their reactions, some skeptical, others clearly convinced that Jason was guilty. The weight of their expectations, coupled with the evidence, was beginning to press heavily on her. The case had taken an unexpected turn when Sarah introduced her first witness, Officer Daniel Harris. The arresting officer, Harris, was a burly man with a stern demeanor. Amanda had seen him many times in court, often giving testimony in cases involving drug arrests or minor offenses. He seemed trustworthy, even though there was something about his tone that was hard to read. Sarah began her questioning with calm precision. "Officer Harris, you were the one who arrested Mr. Miller, correct?" "That's right," Harris responded, his voice deep and gravelly. Sarah continued, "You stated that you apprehended Mr. Miller just 2 blocks from the scene of the robbery. And you also mentioned in your report that he fit the description of the suspect, a man in his mid-30s. Wearing dark clothing. Is that correct? Harris nodded. Yes, that's correct. Did you, at any point, search for any other possible suspects in the area? No, Harris replied. We didn't have time. He was apprehended quickly. Sarah's eyebrows arched slightly. And when you arrested Mr. Miller, did you find a red hoodie on him? The one that the store clerk mentioned seeing the suspect wearing? No, Harris hesitated. We didn't find a hoodie on him. Sarah pressed further. So, you arrested him based on a vague description alone, without any physical evidence linking him directly to the crime? Harris shifted in his seat, visibly uncomfortable. I followed protocol. He matched the description. Amanda observed the exchange closely. There was something in Harris's response that didn't sit right with her. He had followed protocol, but had he followed it blindly? The lack of a red hoodie and the absence of any solid evidence created cracks in the case. And Amanda could sense the tension building. Sarah had a point. Without physical evidence, it was hard to believe that this was a clear-cut case of guilt. But Amanda wasn't finished yet. She had to hear more. She had to know if there was something she was missing. As the trial continued into the evening, Sarah called her next witness, a forensic expert who had reviewed the surveillance footage. The expert, Dr. Neil Carter, was a seasoned professional in video analysis, and his testimony would be crucial. Dr. Carter took the stand, adjusting his glasses as he surveyed the courtroom. Your Honor, the video footage provided by the prosecution is of poor quality, based on the height and build of the individual in the video. I cannot definitively say that it is Mr. Miller. Additionally, the timestamp on the footage appears to have been altered, which raises questions about the reliability of the evidence. Amanda felt a wave of unease wash over her. This was a turning point. The prosecution's most important piece of evidence, the surveillance video, was now under scrutiny. If it was unreliable, then what did they really have? Without solid proof, everything else seemed to hinge on assumptions. The prosecutor, Richard Powell, immediately rose to object, but Sarah's calm demeanor seemed to only reinforce the expert's credibility. Powell tried to discredit Dr. Carter, arguing that the expert's analysis was speculative. But the jury had already begun to shift in their seats, clearly unsettled by the expert's findings. As the day wore on, Amanda felt her responsibility as a judge weigh even more heavily on her. She had to remain impartial. But how could she when every new piece of evidence seemed to poke holes in the prosecution's case? The truth, it seemed, was not as clear as it had appeared at the outset. Was Jason guilty, or had he become a scapegoat for a crime he didn't commit? Amanda's mind flashed back to the days when she and Jason had shared everything: dreams, laughter, and even their frustrations with the world. What had happened to the man she had known? Had the world truly broken him? Or had something else, something darker, changed him over the years? As the court adjourned for the night, Amanda found herself exhausted, both physically and mentally. She hadn't anticipated how deeply this case would affect her. Jason had been a friend, a confidant, and now he was a defendant, standing trial for a crime he claimed he didn't commit. But the questions kept swirling. Was Jason the man the prosecution painted him to be? Was the evidence truly enough to condemn him? Or was there more to this story than met the eye? Amanda had to find out. And she had to do it quickly, before the truth slipped further away from her grasp. As she left the courtroom, she could still hear the faint echo of Jason's voice in her mind. I didn't do it, Amanda. She had no choice but to trust in the system she had sworn to uphold. But the weight of the past, and of Jason's words, would stay with her. The next day, the trial would continue, and the truth would finally come to light. one way or another. The next morning, as Amanda stepped into the courtroom, the air felt different. The usual hum of activity was there, the shuffle of papers, the rustle of courtroom attendants preparing for the day's proceedings, but there was a weight in the atmosphere, as if everyone present could sense that something pivotal was about to unfold. The defense had made its case, and the prosecution was about to present its final arguments. Amanda had spent the entire night going over the evidence, trying to piece together the fractured pieces of Jason's story. She had gone over the footage again, read through the witness testimonies, and thought back to everything she had learned about Jason over the years. Was there more to the story? Was Jason truly guilty, or had the years hardened him in ways she couldn't understand? She took her seat at the bench, her fingers brushing the edge of the gavel. The room quieted as the prosecutor, Richard Powell, stood to make his closing argument. His expression was sharp, professional, he was in his element. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Powell began, his voice steady, "what we have before us is a clear case of assault and robbery. The defendant, Jason Miller, was caught in the act. We have eyewitness testimony, a description that matches, and the stolen money was found in his possession. This is not a case of mistaken identity. The facts are clear. He did this." Amanda's eyes briefly flicked to Jason, sitting silently at the defense table. His expression was unreadable, his eyes staring straight ahead as Powell continued. There was no emotion, no indication of guilt or innocence, just a quiet resignation. It pained Amanda to see him this way. She had known him as a boy full of dreams, not a man who seemed to have already accepted his fate. Powell's voice rang out again. "This is not just about the law. It's about the safety of our community. If we allow people like Jason Miller to go free without facing the consequences of their actions, we are failing in our duty to protect those who cannot protect themselves. He needs to be held accountable." The prosecutor's words hung in the air like a heavy fog, pressing down on everyone in the room. Amanda couldn't help but feel the force of his argument. The jury, she noticed, was nodding in agreement, their faces solemn. But just as the prosecutor finished, the defense attorney, Sarah Hayes, rose to make her closing statement. Sarah was calm, poised, but Amanda could see the intensity behind her eyes. She wasn't going to let this case slip away without a fight. "Members of the jury," Sarah began, her voice carrying a quiet confidence. "The prosecution wants you to believe that Jason Miller is guilty, based on assumptions and shaky evidence. Yes, there was a robbery. Yes, a man was caught with the stolen money. But the question is, was that man Jason Miller? The answer is not so clear." Sarah paused, allowing the weight of her words to settle over the jury. "We have already established that the store clerk could not identify the man who attacked him. We have seen the surveillance footage, which is far too unclear to be used as definitive proof. And most importantly, we've heard from the arresting officer himself, who admitted that he had no physical evidence linking Jason to the crime. Only a vague description that he fit the bill. Is that enough to condemn someone? Should we let assumptions guide us?" Amanda's eyes shifted to Jason as Sarah continued. He hadn't once looked at her during the trial. Not directly. He seemed withdrawn, lost in his own thoughts. But Amanda knew him better than that. She knew there was more to him than what appeared on the surface. "Jason Miller has maintained his innocence throughout this entire process," Sarah said, her voice growing firm. "And if you believe in true justice, you will not allow this man to be convicted based on circumstantial evidence and a faulty identification. We ask that you consider the facts and the truth, not the assumptions that the prosecution wants you to make." Jason deserves the opportunity to prove that he is not the man they say he is. The courtroom was silent. Sarah's words had struck a chord, and Amanda could see that even some members of the jury were visibly shaken. The case was no longer as straightforward as it had seemed. The doubts, the uncertainties, they were real. Amanda leaned forward, her fingers curling around the gavel. She had heard both sides, and now the final decision was in the hands of the jury. She had done everything in her power to remain impartial, but there was no denying that this case had affected her more than any she had ever presided over. The man before her wasn't just a defendant, he was Jason. The boy she had once shared a bond with. The boy who had believed in a better life, and had always had her back. But now, as a judge, she couldn't let personal feelings cloud the truth. Jason's fate would soon be decided. Amanda's heart was heavy as she watched the jury deliberate. Every moment felt stretched out. Every glance exchanged between the jurors seemed to weigh more than it should. Was there enough to convict him? Or had they, as Sarah had said, been led astray by faulty evidence and assumptions? Amanda spent the next few hours in a state of numbness. She couldn't focus on anything other than the quiet buzz of voices in the courtroom, the shuffle of papers, and the occasional glance at the clock. The time dragged on. The deliberation stretched longer than she had expected. When the jury finally filed back into the room, Amanda's heart began to pound in her chest. This was it, the moment of truth. She had no idea which way the verdict would go. She had no idea if the jury would see the cracks in the case or if they would follow the prosecution's lead and convict Jason. The foreperson of the jury stood up and held a piece of paper in her hand, her eyes scanning the room. The tension was palpable. In the case of the state of Ohio versus Jason Miller, the foreperson said, her voice steady but uncertain, "We find the defendant." The courtroom fell into a dead silence, and Amanda felt as though the entire room was holding its breath. This was the moment that would change everything. For Jason, for her, for the justice system. Not guilty. A collective gasp rippled through the room. Jason's shoulders sagged, and for the first time in the entire trial, he looked up. His eyes met Amanda's for the briefest of moments. There was a flicker there. A flicker of something. Relief. Perhaps. Or gratitude. Or maybe it was just the realization that his fight had not been in vain. Amanda's heart pounded in her chest. She had known this moment would come. But it didn't make it any easier. Jason was free to go. But the weight of the decision was heavy. He had won his freedom. But something told Amanda that the road ahead would not be easy for him. Not after all that had happened. As the courtroom emptied, Jason signed his release papers. His back straight, his posture more resolute than it had been throughout the trial. And then, just as Amanda was about to leave the bench, he turned toward her. "You didn't have to say anything," Jason said quietly, his voice raw, "but I'm glad you didn't." Amanda's throat tightened. She wanted to say so many things she had kept bottled up for years. But she couldn't. She had a duty to uphold the law. She had done what she thought was right. But in this moment, she knew there was more to justice than simply following the rules. She nodded, her voice barely a whisper. "I'm sorry, Jason, for everything." Jason gave her a small, faint smile. "It's okay. We were just kids. Remember, we didn't know any better." And with that, he turned and walked out of the courtroom. Amanda stood there for a long moment, her hand resting on the gavel. The truth had come to light, but it had come at a great cost. The courtroom was empty now, but Amanda knew this would be a day she would never forget. The days following the trial passed in a blur for Amanda. She went through the motions of her duties as a judge, hearing cases, giving rulings, but her mind was still preoccupied with Jason Miller. His face, the way his shoulders had sagged when the verdict was read, kept resurfacing in her thoughts. The weight of the case lingered heavily in her heart. She had done her job, upheld the law, but had she done the right thing? Was justice truly served? Amanda couldn't shake the feeling that she hadn't truly understood the depths of what had been happening with Jason all these years. She had known him as a young boy, bright and full of ambition. They had shared dreams of escaping their small town, of finding a better life beyond the confines of Cleveland. But somehow, their paths had diverged, while she had left for law school and climbed the ladder of success. Jason had found himself tangled in the web of the streets, trapped in a life he hadn't chosen. She sat at her desk in the judge's chambers, staring out the window, her mind a whirlwind of thoughts. The courtroom was supposed to be a place where justice prevailed, where the law was the final word. But the trial had shown her that sometimes the law couldn't capture the whole story. The truth was messy, complicated, and sometimes the law couldn't account for the years of hardship, the broken promises, and the pain that shaped a person's life. Amanda's phone buzzed on her desk, snapping her out of her thoughts. It was a message from her assistant. "Kevin, Judge Clark, there's someone here to see you. He says it's important." Amanda frowned. She hadn't expected anyone, and she wasn't in the mood for visitors. But she stood up, smoothed her robe, and made her way to the reception area. When she stepped into the hallway, she froze. Standing there, leaning against the doorframe, was Jason. His expression was more guarded than she had ever seen him. He was dressed in jeans and a jacket, looking like the man he had become, no longer the carefree boy she had known. His eyes met hers, but he didn't smile. There was something different in the way he looked at her now. The years of struggle had left their mark. "Jason," Amanda said, her voice soft, "what are you doing here?" Jason straightened up, his eyes still locked on hers. "I had to talk to you, Amanda. There's something I need to say." Amanda felt a tightness in her chest. She wasn't sure if she was ready for this, if she was ready to confront everything that had happened between them. But she stepped aside, allowing him into her chambers. As he sat across from her, there was a heavy silence between them. Neither of them spoke for a moment, the weight of the trial still hanging in the air. Finally, Jason broke the silence. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said to me that day in court," he began, "about how I've changed, how things went wrong for me." Amanda nodded, unsure of what to say. She had said so many things during the trial, trying to keep her emotions in check, trying to separate her past from her present. But now, in the quiet of her office, it felt different. Jason was no longer just a defendant. He was a man who had lived through things she couldn't imagine. "I know you've had a tough life, Jason," Amanda said quietly, "but I still don't understand how it got to this point. You were so full of hope when we were kids. You wanted to leave. You wanted something better." Jason sighed, his eyes downcast. "I wanted to, Amanda, I really did. But sometimes, you don't get to choose the life you want. It chooses you. I ended up where I am because I didn't have the same opportunities you did. You left Cleveland. You made something of yourself. But I was stuck. I didn't have anyone who believed in me. Not after my family moved away. I was just another kid on the street, trying to survive. And that's where I got lost." Amanda felt a pang of guilt as she listened to him. She had gone on to become a judge, to fight for justice, while Jason had been left behind. She had left the past behind, buried it with the hope that it would stay forgotten. But now, here he was, reminding her of the reality that she had tried so hard to ignore. "I didn't forget you," Jason, she said softly, I never did. But I couldn't. I know, he interrupted, his voice raw. You had to do what you had to do. But when I saw you in that courtroom, I couldn't help but wonder if you saw me as the same person I was back then. Or if you just saw the man I've become. Amanda paused, feeling the weight of his question. Had she really seen him? Or had she just seen the defendant, the man accused of a crime? Had she allowed the past to cloud her judgment of who he had become? I don't know, she whispered. I don't know if I saw you or the case. I thought I could separate everything. But the truth is, I couldn't. I wanted to help. Jason, I wanted to believe you. Jason's gaze softened, and for the first time, Amanda saw the boy she had once known. The boy who had trusted her. The boy who had hoped for a future outside of Cleveland. I know, Amanda, he said, his voice quieter now, but sometimes, things just get too complicated. The choices I made, the mistakes I've made, I can't take them back. But I don't want to be the man everyone expects me to be. I want to change. I want to prove that I'm more than what my past says I am. Amanda felt her heart twist. She had always believed in second chances, in redemption, but could Jason truly change? Could anyone change? Or was the damage of the past too deep? I believe in you, Jason, she said softly, but change doesn't come easy. You have to want it. And you have to fight for it. I can't give you a new life. But I can promise you this. I'll be here. If you need help, if you need someone to talk to, you don't have to do it alone. Jason looked at her, a flicker of something in his eyes, hope. Maybe, or maybe just the recognition that someone still cared. He stood up, his shoulders a little lighter than before. Thank you, Amanda, he said, his voice thick with emotion. That means more than you know. As he turned to leave, Amanda watched him go. For the first time in a long time, she felt a sense of peace. Jason had been given a chance, his freedom, his life. Now, it was up to him to make something of it. And for the first time, Amanda truly believed that maybe, just maybe, he could. The gavel had fallen, the trial was over, but the true test of justice was just beginning, for Jason. And for Amanda herself, as she sat back in her chair, a sense of quiet resolve washed over her. There was more to life than verdicts and rulings. Sometimes, the greatest justice lay in giving people the chance to change, to rise above the weight of their past mistakes, and to find redemption. Amanda knew that it was her duty to keep that hope alive, for Jason and for everyone who walked through the doors of her courtroom. The law was not just about rules, it was about humanity. And that was a lesson she would carry with her for the rest of her life.